Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. Russia is trying to turn threats against Kyiv into a wider test of Western nerve, and Europe is now answering in a more coordinated way. Moscow's warning about systematic strikes on Kyiv's so-called decision-making centers has moved from battlefield messaging into diplomatic intimidation. Nearly 50 countries at the United Nations condemned Russian threats against embassies and diplomatic institutions in Ukraine's capital, while the EU, Germany, Norway, and the Netherlands hauled in Russian diplomats for the kind of conversations nobody enjoys unless their job title includes professional Kremlin explainer. This is an update on the Kyiv pressure campaign, but the new piece is the scale of the diplomatic response. Moscow wanted embassies to calculate risk, maybe thin out staff, maybe create the impression that Kyiv is becoming too dangerous for serious international presence. Europe's answer, at least for now, is we see the move, and no, we are not helping you isolate Ukraine's capital. Dmitry Medvedev then did what Dmitry Medvedev does these days, throwing out a mocking line that Europe must have diplomats to spare. It was ugly, but also revealing. Russia wants the threat to feel personal, not abstract. There is also a slight wobble inside Moscow's own messaging. State Duma Defense Committee Chair Andrei Kartapolov suggested Russia was not necessarily talking about striking the Verkhovna Rada or the presidential office, because the real Ukrainian decision centers are supposedly hidden elsewhere. That is classic Kremlin ambiguity. Make the threat big enough to dominate the room, then leave enough fog to avoid being judged if the promised thunderstorm turns into a damp Tuesday. Belarus is now a key part of that same pressure architecture. Belarusian Security Council Secretary Alexander Volfovich claimed Belarus recorded 116 Ukrainian drone incursions in a single week, including alleged attempts to hit border infrastructure. The important point is not that Belarus appears ready for a ground invasion. The provided reporting does not show a force buildup for that, and Russia likely does not have the spare capacity to back one. The more serious concern is that Moscow may be building a pretext to use Belarusian territory for strikes into western and northwestern Ukraine. That would put pressure on the routes that connect Ukraine to Poland and the rest of Europe. In plain English, Russia may be trying to make Ukraine's back door feel less safe. Now swing north, because the Baltic region is becoming a very uncomfortable collision zone between Ukraine's long-range campaign, Russian electronic warfare, and NATO air defense. Ukrainian drones aimed at Russian energy infrastructure around the Baltic have strayed into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland. Kyiv and Baltic officials blame Russian jamming and spoofing for pushing them off course. Moscow, with the subtlety of a Bond villain who lost the script, claims the Baltic states may be helping Ukraine attack Russia. The risk here is confusion. NATO reportedly fired a missile over Estonia on May 19th at a suspected Ukrainian drone. That was the first defensive missile firing by the alliance's Baltic air policing mission since the Baltic states joined NATO in 2004. Lithuania sent lawmakers underground after a drone approached Vilnius. Latvia's government collapsed after criticism that anti-drone defenses were not deployed quickly enough. This is what spillover looks like in 2026. Not necessarily tanks rolling across borders, but air alerts, spoofed signals, nervous capitals, and everyone trying to figure out who owns the object in the sky. Kaliningrad is the technical engine behind much of the anxiety. Lithuanian officials say Russia has expanded GPS spoofing antennas there from 3 in early 2025 to 36 now. They assess the interference can reach up to 450 kilometers into Europe, affecting the Baltic states, much of Poland, parts of Finland and Sweden, and key Baltic Sea routes. That is not some niche cyber goblin story for a basement full of signal nerds. It can affect aviation tracking, mobile networks, public transit systems, and drone navigation. Russia is trying to make the map lie, and when the map lies, the security environment gets jumpy fast. Europe's answer is becoming more structural. Ursula von der Leyen, standing with Baltic leaders in Lithuania, warned that Moscow is deliberately trying to destabilize democratic societies. NATO is preparing to reinforce defense planning for Latvia and Estonia by assigning the German-Netherlands Corps to that region. Britain and Poland are also signing a new defense and security treaty focused on Russia as a long-term strategic threat. That agreement reaches beyond tanks and trenches. It includes hybrid attacks, cyber operations, espionage, border security, defense industrial cooperation, and air and missile defense. Europe is not just writing strongly worded letters anymore. It is reorganizing the toolshed. Britain's intelligence community is saying the same thing out loud. GCHQ Director Anne Keith-Butler is warning that Russia is scaling up daily hybrid activity against the UK and Europe, targeting critical infrastructure, democratic processes, supply chains, and public trust. She is also warning that China's science, technology, cyber, intelligence, and military capabilities are narrowing the window for the UK and its allies to stay ahead. So the British message is pretty clear. Russia is the guy rattling the fence at midnight, while China is quietly buying the factory that makes the fence, the cameras, and maybe the software subscription. There is also a new sanctions angle worth tracking. Britain sanctioned Russian crypto and financial infrastructure, including the A7 network, which UK authorities say moved more than $90 billion in 2025. That figure is roughly half of Russia's annual military spending. The target set includes crypto exchanges, payment systems, Kyrgyz-linked entities, and other financial plumbing used to bypass sanctions. This is where the war economy gets less cinematic, but extremely important. No dramatic soundtrack, no drone footage, just accountants, shell structures, and payment rails keeping the machine fed. Ukraine, meanwhile, sees an opening but still has a brutal to-do list. Brigadier General Andriy Beletsky, commander of Ukraine's 3rd Army Corps, says the next 6 months may be the most critical period of the war. His view is that Russian forces are exhausted, personnel quality is slipping, and Moscow is struggling to produce major breakthroughs. That matters because any future negotiation will depend heavily on whether Ukraine is seen as holding firm, improving its position, or being slowly squeezed. The battlefield detail here supports the strategic point. Ukraine is trying to change the negotiating math before talks become unavoidable. Ukraine's own long-range strike campaign is helping create that pressure. Russian authorities are preparing to restrict some civilian aviation activity in the Moscow air zone below 5,100 meters beginning June 1st. Kaliningrad Airport temporarily limited flights after a drone warning. The Syzran oil refinery reportedly halted operations after a Ukrainian strike damaged a unit responsible for more than 70% of its capacity. The target list is less important than the effect. Russia is being forced to defend more places, explain more disruptions, and spend more money protecting the rear. But Ukraine's constraints are still very real. Air defense stocks are under strain after repeated Russian attacks, with shortages reported in Patriot and NASAMS interceptors. The economy is battered. The labor force has fallen sharply since the start of the war. Blackouts have cut into growth, and conscription is a serious domestic stress point, with reports of bribery, absenteeism, harsh mobilization practices, and public frustration over whether sacrifice is being shared fairly. That is the big internal variable for Kyiv. Morale is not just about courage, it is also about trust. Inside Russia, Putin is tightening control in ways that feel straight out of the old Soviet drawer. The Kremlin has expanded military political bodies inside the armed forces, modern political commissars by another name, reportedly more than tripling their personnel strength. The stated purpose is morale and discipline. The obvious purpose is loyalty monitoring. Moscow also adopted legislation allowing the arrest of property belonging to Russians abroad, accused of offenses such as violating foreign agent rules or distributing extremist materials. When a government starts reaching across borders for immigrants' property, that is not swagger. That is insecurity with a stamp pad. Finally, Putin is trying to keep Russia's regional influence from looking as battered as its war narrative. In Kazakhstan, he is pairing energy and nuclear cooperation with softer symbolism, including the gift of 4 Amur tigers. Yes, tiger diplomacy is apparently on the menu. At the same time, the Kremlin is pressuring Armenia over its EU ambitions, warning that Yerevan cannot sit comfortably in 2 competing blocs. Russia may be tied down in Ukraine, but it is still trying to remind neighbors that Moscow expects a say in their strategic choices. The empire may be creaking, but it is still grabbing for the microphone. Thanks for listening. If this episode was useful, take a second to leave a review or drop a comment. It makes a real difference in getting this in front of the right audience. We also publish a daily intel brief on Substack at restrictedhandling.substack.com with deeper coverage on Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Have a great day.